Of last night, nitrogen epoxy as a means of execution is no longer an untested method. It is a proven one. To my colleagues across the country, many of which were watching last night, Alabama has done it, and now so can you. And we stand ready to assist you in implementing this method in your states.
March 18th, 2025. Inside Louisiana's infamous Angola prison, the atmosphere felt heavier than usual. Reporters stood outside behind barricades. Protesters gathered in small groups under the dark sky. Some held signs demanding justice for the victim. Others pleaded for mercy. Across America, people were watching closely because what was about to happen had not happened in Louisiana for more than 15 years. A man named Jessie Hoffman Jr. was about to die. Prison guards escorted him slowly toward the execution chamber. Witnesses later described him as calm, not confident, not emotional, just strangely quiet. No dramatic speech, no crying, no final attempt to explain himself. Just silence. Moments before the execution began, a Buddhist spiritual advisor quietly started chanting beside him. The soft rhythm of the prayer echoed through the chamber while Hoffman stood motionless, staring ahead as if he had already left the world long before his body did. Then the mask was secured over his face, and the nitrogen gas began to flow. This was not just another execution. Louisiana had restarted the death penalty after more than a decade and a half without carrying one out. Even more controversial, the state had chosen to use nitrogen gas, a method that many critics argued was experimental, dangerous, and deeply disturbing. Inside the room, witnesses watched carefully. At first, Hoffman barely moved. Then his chest began rising unevenly. His body twitched beneath the restraints. His hands tightened under the blanket covering him. Minutes passed slowly while observers stared in silence, unsure whether what they were seeing looked peaceful or horrifying. Some later admitted they could not stop thinking about the movement of his body long after they left the prison. Nearly 19 minutes after the process began, Jessie Hoffman Jr. was pronounced dead. For some people, it was justice finally delivered after decades of waiting. For others, it was proof that America's system of execution remained deeply flawed. But the thing haunting the country was not only the way Jessie Hoffman died. It was the story of how everything began almost 30 years earlier. Back in 1996, a young woman named Molly Elliott was simply trying to live her life. She was 28 years old. Friends describe her as kind, dependable, and hardworking. She had a steady job in New Orleans and a future that still seemed wide open ahead of her. On the night she disappeared, there was nothing unusual about her routine. She finished work and prepared to head home, just like she had done countless times before. She had no idea someone was watching her, and she could never have imagined that within a few hours, she would be dead beside a dark riverbank in St. Tammany Parish. The person responsible was an 18-year-old named Jessie Hoffman. At the time, he was legally an adult, but barely. According to investigators, Hoffman approached Molly with a gun and forced her into a nightmare that unfolded piece by piece across the night. He abducted her, forced her to withdraw money from an ATM, then ordered her to drive away from the city toward a remote area outside New Orleans. Their prosecutors said Molly Elliott was sexually assaulted before being shot in the head. One moment she was alive, terrified, hoping somehow she might survive. The next moment, everything was gone. Her future, her family's future, every plan she still had left in life. Gone beside a river in the darkness. But what shocked people almost as much as the murder itself was what Jessie Hoffman allegedly did afterward. Authorities later said that after killing Molly Elliott, Hoffman returned to normal life with almost no visible emotion. Investigators claimed he used the stolen money to go shopping with his girlfriend, as if nothing had happened. That detail stayed with people for years, because it made the crime feel even colder. No panic, no immediate confession, no obvious breakdown. Just an 18-year-old calmly continuing his night while a murdered woman's family desperately searched for answers. As the years passed, the case slowly transformed into something much larger than a single murder investigation. Because while sitting on death row, Jessie Hoffman changed. Or at least that is what his lawyers insisted. During his decades in prison, Hoffman converted to Buddhism. His attorneys later described him as deeply spiritual, remorseful, and no longer the violent teenager who committed the crime in 1996. They argued that years of meditation, prayer, and reflection had transformed him into a completely different person. But for Molly Elliott's family, none of that erased what happened. Their daughter was still dead. And every birthday, every holiday, every passing year only reminded them of the life stolen from them beside that riverbank. By the time Louisiana prepared to execute Jessie Hoffman in 2025, the case had become part murder story, part national debate. Because it forced America to confront a terrifying question. Can someone who commits an unforgivable act ever truly change? And if they can, what exactly is the purpose of execution? Is it justice? Revenge? Closure? Or simply another form of violence carried out by the state itself? For nearly 30 years, those questions followed Jessie Hoffman all the way to the execution chamber. And on the night he finally died, he never answered any of them. Long before America argued over whether Jessie Hoffman deserved to die, he was just another boy growing up in Louisiana. No one looked at him as a child and imagined he would someday become one of the most controversial death penalty cases in the state's history. There were no television cameras back then, no courtroom sketches, no reporters waiting outside prison walls. Just a quiet kid growing up in an environment that many people later described as deeply unstable. According to defense attorneys and court records, Hoffman's childhood was shaped by violence, neglect, emotional instability, and dysfunction inside the home. People who later defended him claimed he spent much of his early life surrounded by chaos instead of guidance. The details painted a dark picture. Arguments inside the house, emotional isolation, a lack of structure, a lack of safety. By the time he reached his teenage years, Hoffman had already begun drifting toward trouble. He reportedly fell into bad circles, became involved in petty crimes, and struggled with anger and emotional control. People who knew him during that period later described someone who often seemed detached from others, distant, like a teenager, carrying something heavy inside himself that he could not explain. And yet, despite all of that, nobody clearly predicted murder. Because the terrifying truth about many killers is this: before the crime happens, they often look completely ordinary. Jessie Hoffman was not some famous criminal mastermind. He was not a violent gang leader known across the city. To most people, he was simply another troubled young man trying to find direction in life. But underneath that ordinary image, something dangerous was growing. Years later, his defense team would argue that Hoffman's brain was still immature at the time of the murder. Scientific research, they claimed, showed that young adults, especially teenagers around 18 years old, often struggle with impulse control, emotional regulation, and long-term judgment because the brain is still developing. That argument eventually became one of the biggest controversies in the case. Because in 1996, Jessie Hoffman was technically an adult, but only barely. And the difference between young man and fully mature adult would later become the dividing line between life and death inside the courtroom. To prosecutors, however, none of those explanations changed what happened on the night Molly Elliott disappeared. Because according to investigators, the crime did not look impulsive. It looked controlled. It began in New Orleans after Molly finished work and prepared to drive home. Somewhere along the way, Hoffman approached her with a gun and forced her into her own vehicle. The city around them remained alive with lights, traffic, and ordinary people completely unaware that a kidnapping was unfolding nearby. Step by step, the situation escalated. First came the ATM withdrawal. Authorities later discovered records showing Molly withdrawing money while under threat. Imagine the fear she must have felt standing in front of that machine, fully aware that the armed man beside her controlled whether she lived or died. Maybe she hoped that if she cooperated, he would let her go. Maybe she believed this was only a robbery. But then the drive continued, away from a city, away from witnesses, away from safety. The further they traveled, the more terrifying the situation must have become. Eventually, Hoffman forced Molly toward a remote wooded area near the Middle Pearl River in St. Tammany Parish. The location was isolated, dark, and quiet enough that almost nobody would hear what happened there that night. Somewhere during that drive, Molly Elliott likely realized the horrifying truth. This was probably never going to end with her walking away alive, because robbers usually take money and leave. But Jessie Hoffman kept going. According to prosecutors, once they reached the remote area near the riverbank, Molly was sexually assaulted before being shot in the head. One gunshot. That was all it took to destroy an entire future. A daughter disappeared forever. A family's life shattered permanently. A normal evening transformed into a nightmare that would continue haunting Louisiana for decades. And while Molly Elliott's family spent the night desperately searching for answers, Jessie Hoffman drove away from the scene. The most disturbing part? Authorities later claimed he behaved almost normally afterward. No public panic. No emotional collapse. No immediate attempt to confess. Instead, investigators said he used the stolen money to shop with his girlfriend as though nothing significant had happened at all. That detail shocked people across the country because it suggested something deeply unsettling. The teenager who committed this crime did not appear haunted by it. At least not yet. But police were already beginning to close in. And soon, one of Louisiana's most infamous murder investigations would explode into public view. The moment Molly Elliott failed to return home, people close to her sensed that something was terribly wrong. She was dependable, responsible, the kind of person who did not suddenly disappear without explanation. At first, her family tried convincing themselves there had to be a reasonable answer. Maybe her car broke down. Maybe she stayed late somewhere. Maybe there had been an accident. But as the hours passed without a phone call or any sign of her, fear slowly began turning into panic. Then came the discovery that shattered everything. Molly Elliott's body was found near the Middle Pearl River in St. Tammany Parish, abandoned in a remote wooded area far from New Orleans. The crime scene horrified investigators. This was not a simple robbery gone wrong. Molly had been abducted, sexually assaulted, and executed with a gunshot to the head. Detectives quickly realized the killer had moved her across multiple locations during the night, which meant the crime involved planning, control, and deliberate choices at every stage. The public reaction was immediate. A young woman had been taken off the street by a stranger and murdered in terrifying fashion. News of the case spread rapidly across Louisiana, feeding fear throughout the community. People started asking the same question. If this could happen to Molly Elliott, could it happen to anyone? Meanwhile, investigators worked nonstop to reconstruct her final hours. One of the most important breakthroughs came from the ATM withdrawal force during the kidnapping. Authorities traced financial records and surveillance evidence connected to the transaction, allowing detectives to narrow down the timeline of the crime. That evidence became critical, because unlike many murder investigations that rely entirely on witnesses or confessions, this case left a trail behind. A trail of movements. A trail of transactions. A trail leading directly toward Jessie Hoffman. As detectives dug deeper, witnesses began connecting Hoffman to suspicious activity surrounding the night Molly disappeared. Bit by bit, the evidence started forming a complete picture. And then investigators uncovered a detail that shocked even seasoned detectives. According to authorities, after murdering Molly Elliott, Hoffman used the stolen money to go shopping with his girlfriend. That single detail became one of the most disturbing parts of the entire case, because it suggested an almost unbelievable emotional detachment from what had just happened. While Molly's family was desperately searching for their daughter, while investigators were processing a brutal murder, seeing the man accused of killing her was allegedly spending stolen cash like it was an ordinary night. To many people, that behavior felt colder than the murder itself. Eventually, police moved in. Jessie Hoffman was arrested and charged with kidnapping, rape, and first-degree murder. And once the details reached the media, public outrage exploded. Television reports focused heavily on the terrifying sequence of events: the abduction, the forced ATM withdrawal, the isolated riverbank, and the execution-style killing. The story quickly became one of the most talked about crimes in Louisiana. Pressure immediately mounted on prosecutors to pursue the harshest punishment available under the law: death. But even in the middle of public anger, one fact complicated everything. Jessie Hoffman was only 18 years old, legally an adult, but still extremely young. That detail divided people almost instantly. To Molly Elliott's family, his age changed nothing. Their daughter was dead forever. No explanation about trauma or youth could erase what happened beside that riverbank in 1996. But defense attorneys and anti-death penalty advocates saw the case differently. They argued that an 18-year-old brain is not fully developed, that young people are more impulsive, more emotionally unstable, and more capable of change later in life. And over time, that argument would grow larger than Jessie Hoffman himself, because the case slowly transformed into something bigger than one murder investigation. It became part of a national debate about age, punishment, redemption, and whether society should ever execute someone who committed a crime so young. But before those arguments could reach the higher courts, there was still a trial waiting ahead. And inside that courtroom, Molly Elliott's final moments will be described in horrifying detail. By the time Jessie Hoffman entered the courtroom, much of the public had already decided exactly who he was. To many people across Louisiana, this case did not feel complicated. A young woman had been kidnapped at gunpoint, forced to withdraw money, sexually assaulted, and murdered beside a riverbank. The details were horrifying enough that outrage spread quickly through newspapers, television reports, and communities across the state. But inside the courtroom, the battle became far more complicated than the headline suggested. Prosecutors presented Hoffman as cold, deliberate, and fully aware of every decision he made that night. According to the state, this was not a crime driven by panic or sudden emotion. Investigators argued that Hoffman controlled the situation from beginning to end. He approached Molly Elliott with a gun, forced her into compliance, made her withdraw money, drove her away from the city, then took her to an isolated area where she was sexually assaulted and killed. To prosecutors, the sequence of events showed planning and control. And because of that, they argued there was only one appropriate punishment: death. But the defense fought back aggressively. Hoffman's attorneys painted a very different picture of the 18-year-old sitting in the courtroom. They argued that he came from a deeply damaged upbringing filled with instability, neglect, emotional trauma, and violence. According to the defense, the environment surrounding Hoffman during childhood shaped the person he eventually became. Then came the argument that would follow the case for decades: his age. At the time of the murder, Jessie Hoffman was only 18 years old, legally an adult, but still extremely young. Defense attorneys argued that teenagers and young adults often lack full emotional maturity because the human brain is still developing during those years. Impulse control, judgment, and decision-making abilities are not fully formed yet. The defense wanted jurors to see more than just the crime itself. They wanted them to see a damaged teenager shaped by trauma and immaturity. But prosecutors rejected that idea completely, because regardless of his age, Molly Elliott was still dead. And unlike Hoffman, she would never get another chance to grow older, rebuild her life, or change who she was. Inside the courtroom, Molly's family listened as prosecutors described the terrifying details of her final hours. Every forced action, every moment of fear, every decision leading toward the riverbank where her life ended. For them, the legal arguments about psychology and brain development could never erase the reality of what happened. A daughter had been taken from them forever. After hearing the evidence, the jury convicted Jessie Hoffman of first-degree murder. Then came the sentencing phase, the moment that would determine whether he spent the rest of his life inside prison walls or whether the state would eventually execute him. The jury chose death. Just like that, an 18-year-old became a condemned man. For Molly Elliott's loved ones, the verdict brought a sense of justice. But even then, nothing could truly repair the damage left behind by the murder. Birthdays, holidays, family gatherings, Every passing year would continue reminding them of the life stolen in 1996. Meanwhile, Jessie Hoffman entered a world few people ever leave alive. Death row. Days became months. Months became years. Years slowly turned into decades. Like many death penalty cases in America, the legal process stretched endlessly through appeals, hearings, and challenges filed by both sides. Lawyers fought over the conviction, the sentencing, and eventually even the method the state planned to use to kill him. And during those decades behind bars, something unexpected happened. Jessie Hoffman changed, or at least that is what the people closest to him claimed. While imprisoned, Hoffman converted to Buddhism. According to his attorneys and spiritual advisors, he spent years meditating, praying, and reflecting on the crime that destroyed multiple lives. They described him as remorseful, peaceful, and no longer the violent teenager who committed murder in 1996. But many people refused to believe true redemption was possible after a crime like this. Could decades of prayer erase murder? Could a killer truly become a different human being? Or was prison simply teaching condemned men how to survive emotionally while waiting for death? As the years passed, America itself also began changing. Public support for the death penalty slowly declined. Some states abolished executions completely. Others struggled to obtain lethal injection drugs. Louisiana eventually stopped carrying out executions for more than 15 years, leaving prisoners like Hoffman trapped in legal limbo. For a while, it almost seemed possible that Jessie Hoffman might die naturally in prison before the state ever executed him. But then Louisiana made a decision that shocked the country. The state announced executions were returning, and this time they planned to use nitrogen gas. For years, Jessie Hoffman's execution felt uncertain. Louisiana had not carried out an execution in more than 15 years. Legal battles, drug shortages, and growing opposition to capital punishment had effectively frozen the death penalty inside the state. Many people believed Hoffman would spend the rest of his life on death row without ever actually facing execution. But behind the scenes, Louisiana officials were preparing to bring executions back, and they planned to do it in a way that immediately triggered national controversy. Instead of lethal injection, the state announced it would use nitrogen hypoxia, a method involving pure nitrogen gas. Supporters claimed it would be more reliable and potentially less painful than traditional execution methods. Critics called it experimental and deeply disturbing. Almost immediately, legal challenges began. Hoffman's attorneys fought desperately to stop the execution. They argued that nitrogen gas executions had not been studied enough and warned the process could cause extreme suffering. They also argued that Hoffman's Buddhist beliefs should prevent the state from using a mask that covered his face during his final moments. But the courts ultimately rejected those arguments. The execution would move forward. As the date approached, public attention returned to the case for the first time in years. News outlets revisited the details of Molly Elliott's murder. Activists on both sides reignited debates over morality, justice, and whether America should still be executing prisoners in modern times. Then finally, March 18, 2025 arrived. Inside Angola prison, witnesses gathered inside the execution chamber. Reporters, officials, attorneys, and family representatives watched quietly as Jessie Hoffman was brought into the room. Observers later described him as calm, not emotional, not angry, just silent. A Buddhist spiritual advisor stood nearby, chanting softly while Hoffman prepared for death. Unlike many condemned prisoners, he did not deliver a long final speech. Then the mask was placed over his face, and a nitrogen gas began flowing. At first, very little happened. Then witnesses noticed movement. According to reports, Hoffman's body began twitching beneath the restraints. His breathing changed. His chest moved unevenly while observers watched in complete silence. Some witnesses later described the process as deeply unsettling, saying the movements continued for several minutes before his body finally became still. Nearly 19 minutes after the execution started, Jessie Hoffman Jr. was pronounced dead. And just like that, one of Louisiana's longest-running death penalty cases was finally over. But outside the prison walls, the arguments only grew louder. Supporters of the execution said justice had finally been delivered after nearly 3 decades. To them, Molly Elliott's family had waited long enough. They believed the state had fulfilled its responsibility by punishing the man convicted of kidnapping, assaulting, and murdering an innocent woman. Others saw something very different. Human rights groups condemned the nitrogen gas execution almost immediately. Critics argued that the visible physical reactions during the process proved the method was far from humane. Some compared it to human experimentation. And then there was the deeper moral question surrounding Hoffman himself. By the time he died, he was no longer the frightened-looking 18-year-old from 1996. He had spent decades behind bars. According to spiritual advisors and attorneys, he had changed dramatically through Buddhism, reflection, and remorse. So what exactly had Louisiana executed? The monster from 1996? Or an older man transformed by decades of punishment and regret? That question haunted even some people who believed Molly Elliott deserved justice. Because the death penalty forces society into an uncomfortable position. It asks whether human beings should still be defined forever by the single worst thing they have ever done. In the case of Jessie Hoffman, America could never fully agree on the answer. After Jessie Hoffman's execution, Louisiana officials declared the sentence complete. The state considered the case closed. Nearly 3 decades after Molly Elliott was murdered beside a riverbank in St. Tammany Parish, the man convicted of killing her was finally dead. For supporters of capital punishment, that outcome represented justice delayed but ultimately delivered. But outside the prison walls, the arguments surrounding the case refused to disappear. Instead, they became even louder. News organizations across America replayed the details of the nitrogen gas execution for days. Witness descriptions of Hoffman's body twitching beneath the restraints sparked immediate controversy. Human rights organizations questioned whether the method could truly be described as humane. Anti-death penalty activists warned that Louisiana had reopened a dangerous chapter in modern executions. At the same time, many people felt no sympathy whatsoever for Jessie Hoffman. To them, the conversation remained painfully simple. A 28-year-old woman had been abducted, sexually assaulted, and murdered. Molly Elliott never received another chance at life. She never got decades to reflect, pray, or reinvent herself inside prison walls. She simply died. And for Molly's loved ones, that reality mattered more than any debate happening on television or inside courtrooms. But others could not stop thinking about how much time had passed between the crime and the execution. Almost 30 years. That meant the state did not execute the same teenager who committed murder in 1996. Instead, Louisiana executed a middle-aged man who had spent decades aging inside a prison cell. A man his attorneys claimed had transformed spiritually through Buddhism, remorse, and reflection. And that is where the story becomes deeply uncomfortable. Because if a person genuinely changes, what should society do with that fact? Should redemption matter? Or does certain violence permanently erase the possibility of forgiveness forever? Those questions have haunted America's death penalty system for generations. Some people believe execution is necessary because certain crimes are simply too horrific for anything less. Others argue that killing prisoners decades later serves no purpose beyond revenge carried out through legal procedure. The Jessie Hoffman case forced both sides to confront something difficult. Two truths existed at the same time. Molly Elliott was an innocent woman whose life was stolen in terrifying fashion. And Jessie Hoffman may also have become a very different person from the violent 18-year-old who committed the crime. But even if both things are true, how should justice respond? That question has no easy answer. And perhaps that is why cases like this continue haunting the public long after the execution itself is over. Because people want clean endings to terrible stories. They want certainty, closure. A final moment where everything suddenly makes sense. But real life rarely works that way. Even after Jessie Hoffman's death, Molly Elliott's family still carries the pain of losing her. Nothing about the execution could bring their daughter back or restore the future stolen from them in 1996. And at the same time, critics of the execution continue asking whether the state truly proved anything by killing a man after decades of imprisonment. In the end, both Molly Elliott and Jessie Hoffman became permanently tied together inside one horrifying story. One lost her future in a single night. The other lost the rest of his life waiting to die for it. And somewhere between those two tragedies lies the question America still cannot answer. Does execution create justice? Or simply another death?